Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Aspen Institute. I'm Crystal Logan, Vice President of Aspen Community Programs and Engagement, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this great event tonight. This is a Hurst Lecture Series program, and I want to give a special thanks to Bob and Soledad Hurst for their sponsorship of this series. Thank you so much. Thank you to our Aspen Society members and our community donors for supporting our ability to host these talks. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. As we talk tonight about extreme weather and climate-fueled risk, I want to acknowledge one local effort that is helping our communities move from awareness to action. The Wildfire Collaborative Roaring Fork Valley has launched thanks to early support from Bob and Soledad Hurst, whose gift funded the Roadmap to Wildfire Resilience, which was a strategic plan led by the Nature Conservancy and the Aspen Institute. That roadmap laid the foundation for coordinated wildfire action across our region and directly seeded the creation of the collaborative. Today, the Wildfire Collaborative has over 50 agencies, organizations, and local leaders working together to reduce wildfire risk, protect our watershed, and build long-term community resilience. For more information, you can check out their website at rfbwildfire.org. Given the importance of this topic, we're honored to have Jeff Goodell and Porter Fox with us this evening. Jeff is an award-winning author and journalist, having covered climate change for more than 2 decades for a variety of national news outlets. His most recent book is the New York Times bestseller, The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. It was named the best book of the year and was nominated for other distinguished awards. He also authored 6 previous books, including The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and The Remaking of the Civilized World, which was a New York Times Critics' Top Book in 2017. Porter Fox is the author of 4 books, most recently Category 5, Superstorms and the Warming Oceans That Feed Them, which was nominated for the 2024 Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction. He also wrote Deep, The Story of Skiing and the Future of Snow, which should be required reading for all of us here in Aspen. His work has been featured on the cover of the New York Times Sunday Review. He has presented to both Senate and Congress, and he was also featured at the 2015 Paris Agreement. He's a McDowell Fellow and teaches at Columbia University School of Arts. Both Jeff and Porter will be in the lobby after the event signing books. And finally, we're thrilled to have our friend Carolyne Heldman Rivera moderating this discussion. She's been in media for 35 years. She was the executive director at Aspen Public Radio, and now is the podcast host and producer for The Lens, which is a nonprofit news organization in New Orleans. So please join me in welcoming Jeff, Porter, and Carolyne. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. So, Jeff, the book you wrote, The Waters Will Come, the water did come in Texas. It came fast. It came at an unimaginable pace. And we, in our vernacular now, we tend to refer to these events as 500-year storms or 100-year storms or generational events. The reality is this is the generation we're living in, these extreme events right now. And I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the devastating loss in Texas a week ago. Weather is undoubtedly reshaping our cities, our systems, our lives. I wanted to ask you both how it came to be that you wrote these books, what shaped you. Porter, I know in your intro to your book, you said that you didn't bird dog the book, that it begged to be written from your experiences. So I want you both to talk about what experiences you had that had you write these 2 books.
I was offshore sailing with a guy named John Kretschmer, who's probably the preeminent storm sailor. He circumnavigated the planet 3 times on a sailboat, sailed through 2 or 3 hurricanes. And I was learning to storm sail and kind of refreshing offshore sailing before taking my family out on a trip. And he started talking about how the trade winds had shifted in the last 30 years or so. Just not much, 5-10 degrees, a little more out of the east, less out of the northeast. Then he talked about the Gulf Stream that he used to ride, delivering boats from east coast of America to Europe. And the tail end, a little meander that goes off the tip of Greenland past Ireland. He used to get about 2.5 knots of extra current there, which is 50 miles a day for free on a sailboat. And it just slowed down and eventually stopped. And it was affecting his route planning, his provisioning, and all this stuff. And as I'm listening to this, and I think Jeff and I do this a lot, we go out in the field, we talk to a lot of people, but we're listening in for some type of hook, some kind of time peg about the climate crisis as it's unfolding. And I took that information back to a guy named Hiroki, Murakami, that's his last name, at the GFDL lab in Princeton, New Jersey. And he said, absolutely, that's what's happening. And here are the other things that are happening. And what John anecdotally saw was planetary systems that create climate on every continent on the planet shifting. That's what these trade winds are. That's what this overturning current, the oceanic conveyor belt, is doing. This big current, this underwater river is kind of sucking down cold water, moving carbon and heat all around the world, and the Gulf Stream is a part of that. So he was watching this, writing about it in his logbook for 30 years, and let's say 10, 15 years later, it's in the headlines, hey, this is happening. So that's how that book started, very organically. And on the rest of the book, I just try to find more answers to those questions.
Okay.
Well, first I want to say thanks to the Institute for hosting this. This is amazing, and thank you all for coming out on a night like this to talk about a subject like this. I know there are a lot of other things you could all be doing, and it's amazing to see all of you here, so thank you. And I also want to say about the Texas floods, it makes this conversation terribly, tragically relevant. It's something that I live in Austin. I felt this personally, not only because my wife and I were standing on our back porch on July 3rd and watching this torrential downpour come down, and knew it was going to be trouble somewhere. Also, we had just last Thanksgiving rented a house right in Hunt, literally where the worst of this flooding was. It was beautiful. We had a wonderful time. We kayaked on the river and swam, and seeing what has happened now, is just very personal and very, very tragic. For this book, it started in a very personal way also. I had been writing about climate change for a long time, never really thought about the idea of heat, even though the phrase global warming sort of suggests that heat might have something to do with it. But I never really thought about it in any kind of personal way. Then I happened to be in Phoenix in the summer of 2017 doing some reporting on another story. I was staying downtown. I was late for a meeting with some city planners, and my Uber was late also, as usual. So I decided I would just run 10 blocks to my meeting. And this was not a good idea. It was 115 degrees that day. I went out of the hotel, ran into this wall of heat, and thought, oh, no big deal. And then 5 blocks later, my heart was pounding, I was feeling dizzy, and I thought, oh, this could be dangerous. And the fact that that had never occurred to me, that heat could be dangerous in a personal way, that it could kill you very quickly. And I thought, wow, I've been writing about climate change for 20 years, and I've never really thought about it being dangerous in a personal way. if I don't understand this, I bet a lot of other people don't. And I thought, hey, that might be an idea for a book. Thus, The Heat Will Kill You First was born, and thus the title was born also. The idea of the book was to try to make heat, this experience of heat, personal. And the title, which my publishers, when I first proposed it, were like, no way are you titling your book, The Heat Will Kill You First. Forget it. And I had to fight for it. But I really wanted to make it intimate that way, because I think too much talk about climate change, too much thinking about climate change is about future generations, about brown people in faraway places, whatever. It's not about your life and what it means to you personally. And so this book was my attempt to do that.
In what ways in your reporting, both of you, have you seen how these changes and climate change are shaping people's lives on a day-to-day?
I've been thinking about that a lot, and I would say for all time, humans, at least for 200,000 years since we've been around, have been observing climate, and climate has shaped their lives.
And moving.
I mean, we were in East Africa 15,000 years ago, and there were miles of ice over New York City and over Europe, and all that water was locked up in those glaciers, and there was a massive drought in the Rift Valley, and humans started having to work together in order to hunt. They were very solitary before that. Now you see these group things. You see communities starting to form, families sticking together and creating what eventually became human civilization, and a big step there. That was climate change, The same with when the glaciers, were receding. A lot of Native Americans on the east coast of America were living out on the ocean plains. The sea level had dropped 220 feet, 250 feet. And lobstermen and scallopers around the island I grew up in, Maine, are still dredging up old urns and old pieces of pottery and from settlements that were out there that they move on back. Hurricanes are shaping it just the same. But the problem is human civilization finds a spot that they like, they settle down, and we have this kind of dream that nothing ever changes.
Census now, the most recent census shows that people are moving towards heat in the United States.
I did it.
Yeah.
and hurricane.
And hurricanes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm a great example of it, right? I mean, people moving, there's lots of reasons why they do it, right? It's not a purely kind of rational thing in the sense of climate rationality. I moved from upstate New York, where Porter lives now, and lovely place climate-wise, cool, lots of trees, lots of water. There's no haven from climate change, but there are better and worse places, and it's a pretty good place. And I moved to Austin, Texas, which is the belly of the climate beast. I mean, no sane person, if you were thinking about climate change and making rational decisions, would do what I did. But I did because I fell in love with a woman who lived in Austin, and I wanted to be with her. And so I'm a writer, and I can do it from anywhere, so I moved to Austin, and I'm really glad I did. But it just shows that these decisions about where we live are complicated, right? They have to do with jobs. They have to do with relationships. Where are your kids? Do you want to be with your kids? Would you rather be on your own in a relatively safe farm in Vermont, or do you want to be, with your grandchildren on the beach, on the Outer Banks? I mean, it's complicated questions, and so I think everybody has to parse this stuff in their own way, and we're, I think we're starting to see more and more movement around this, and I think one of the drivers of this that again, not to endlessly personalize this, but why not? My mom has a house in Northern California that is highly at risk for wildfire. And, we've decided that we have to sell it because insurance rates are, one of the reasons is insurance rates are so high. That's going to be driving a lot of people relocating, because when you have insurance rates that are as high or higher than your mortgage, or even you're trying to buy a house and you can't get a mortgage because of the insurance will not insure it because of wildfire risk or flood risk, that's going to change the dynamics of where Americans live in a very big way.
I did want to talk about that, about storm-ridden places too, where people just rebuild, and the sense of place that people have, and you write about that a lot. But
yeah, I mean, just like Jeff said, it's home. Your family is there. You don't want to pick up and move after one hurricane comes, but after 15 hurricanes come, especially in Florida.
And Louisiana has no insurance anymore.
Louisiana, it's very tricky. There's 60 million people living between Texas and Maine, all in Hurricane Alley, all susceptible to really massive storms that are growing every single year, not so much in number, but more in intensity. It is very difficult to find a place where you want to be. You want to be near your family, whatever, but being in the southern coast of Florida is really not a great idea right now.
Right. Jeff, you write in your book that heat is the prime mover of the climate crisis. But we don't seem to talk about it as much. The other more dramatic examples, the storms, the fires, get more attention. Why do you think that is? And is the media at fault?
Well, let's think about this in a couple of ways. I want to think about this in a couple of ways. First of all, the idea of heat in my book and in general, I want you to think about it in two ways. One is the heat will kill you first idea, that if you go for a hike on a hot day on a sunny southern slope and don't have shade, don't have water, you could be dead in an hour. And then my opening chapter of my book is about people outside of Yosemite who that exactly happened to, and you can read all the details about that. But heat is also this sort of prime mover of all of these climate impacts, right? The reason these Texas floods were so intense is because a hotter atmosphere holds more water. Water vaporizes, it rises up into the air. The air becomes much more like a sponge. It's very simple, straightforward physics. There's no debating this there's no debating if you're someone who takes science seriously. This is not some sort of fringe science idea. It's very basic physics. So heat is driving, as you know, hurricanes. It drives wildfires. The reason Aspen is at risk is because of hotter, drier weather that dries out the soil, dries out the trees. So when there is a spark, it burns hotter, it burns bigger. So heat works in two ways, right? As this personal thing and as this prime mover. And yes, the media has done a terrible job in general. I hate talking about the media, partly because it's this multi-headed gorgon that, what's different to talk about network news, it's different to talk about what the New York Times is doing, it's different to talk about what people are saying on Substack, what are they saying on Blue Sky or Twitter. So the media is really complicated, and there's all kinds of ways. But the main problem with the heat will kill you part of the heat story is that it's invisible, right? A hurricane, everybody knows what a hurricane looks like. Palm trees are bent over, buildings are flying, roofs are flying off. You don't walk out into a hurricane and say, oh my God, I didn't realize there was a hurricane, right? It's obvious. With heat, I can be sitting at home in my office in Austin and look out the window and I can't tell if it's 70 degrees or 120 degrees out there. There's no visual clues. And so for the media, that's really tough because, what do you do on a heat wave? You show pictures of kids playing in sprinklers or something. It's it doesn't exactly communicate the risk, right? So it's a really, of all of the kind of climate impacts, it's the most invisible.
Okay. Porter, you often write about the extreme edges of the world. And tell us about ways that what happens there ripples into our lives in ways that we might not notice.
Well, it's kind of, all the climactic shifts that we feel, these are not one-off things. It's all a reaction to something else that has happened. Something happens, and then we feel a reaction to it. And that is how our climate system works. That's how planetary systems work. And a lot of times, you are way out in the wild, on a glacier in Alaska, in Antarctica, out in the deep ocean, to actually really kind of see the pure origin of some of this geophysical fallout from climate change. And so, I don't know, it just seems to be an easy place to pick up a story. Just go as far as you can out into the wild, and you'll really see it. That's how Jeremy Jones started to protect our winters, was watching the snow level rising, in the Sierras. I was skiing, ski mountaineering in Peru in 1999, and met a farmer. We were skiing a 20,000-foot mountain that was fully glaciated. It was freezing cold, but down at the bottom it was hot as hell. And he was moving his entire village because the glacier had receded so far they couldn't water their crops or their livestock or whatnot, and they were just going to find a different place to live. And that's where I found that story. So it's a good place to find stories. I know Jeff has been to just as many places like that, and it's really pure nature out there, and that's where you can see the origins of some of this.
I want to talk a little bit about policy. First, though, what cities or countries do you think are making good adaptations right now? And I mean, I guess on the flip side, who's not? It's kind of glaringly obvious who's not, but
I mean, you can always point to
well?
Scandinavia. They seem to do everything a little faster and better. But, there's the UK and Denmark and Norway, and that whole kind of Northern Europe zone is very progressive. They've latched onto carbon pricing. They have net zero goals that are in the next 10 to 15 years they're on track to meet. But 5 of those countries have massive oil drilling leases in the North Sea. And that's how they're paying for a lot of this. Like, climate change mitigation is not cheap. It's very expensive. So there's always this counterbalance to progress with climate change, and we just got to kind of put our heads down and just keep pushing. And that's better than nothing, but it would be really great to see, a country like Nigeria that's making terrific leaps and bounds in renewables, and also oil drilling there, but I'm not sure they're reaping all the financial rewards from that.
what about infrastructure in cities that are making adaptations to heat?
Right. So when you talk about, who's doing what with on climate change, right? There's 2 aspects of it. There's the cutting emissions part of it, like the moving away from fossil fuels, which is sort of what Porter's talking about, and then there's the adaptation side. And for a long time in the climate world, people were not supposed to talk about adaptation because the idea was that we need to put all of our energy on cutting emissions, and if you start talking about adapting, then you're going to dissipate the energy to cut. Like what energy?
Given up.
But like whatever energy there is or was to cutting emissions, you're going to dissipate it by talking about adapting. But that has changed since it's become very, stunningly obvious that we're not cutting emissions anyway. So we need to adapt because climate change is no longer some theoretical thing. It's happening right now, right? Wiping out children camps on the Guadalupe River in Texas. It is not a future event anymore. So it's become okay to start talking about adaptation now, which is really important because it's really urgent that we do think differently about how we build our cities, how we live. Because the big rule about climate is that, we've built our world for a climate that no longer exists. And that, if there's one thing I think to understand about how to think about climate change, it's that. Because if we all sell our SUVs and ride skateboards to work and go to zero emissions tomorrow, which is of course not going to happen, we're doing the opposite, but even if that happened, we would not go back to the climate that we all grew up in. All that would do would be halt the warming where we are. Right, so the glaciers would continue to melt. All of the climate impacts that we're seeing would continue, even if we went to zero emissions. So we have to rebuild our world for this new, more violent, and more extreme climate that we're living in. And that's an enormous job because, adapting to this, whether it's, sea level rise and, a lot of it is sort of banal, boring things that no politician wants to really talk about, like in South Florida, you were mentioning, it's not just that sea level rise and storm surge are flooding people's houses, but it's salt water getting into the drinking water supply, impacting sewage, the whole sewage network. Those kinds of things are really expensive to replumb. If you want to, think about adapting to climate change, think about replumbing South Florida, right? And think about being a politician that's their platform, new sewage for Florida. You wonder why it's not happening, right? It's not the kind of thing that you're going to get the MAGA people on board with and build a center coalition around replumbing South Florida. So this adaptation stuff is really hard. And you asked me who's doing it. So this is a long-winded way. Nobody's doing it very well. Some places are doing it better than others. I think the paradigm of climate adaptation in the world, who's doing the most in all kinds of ways, is Paris. Paris is doing incredible things, from cleaning up the Seine for swimming, limiting vehicles in town, re-insulating low-income housing to make it the buildings cooler and things like that, all kinds of things. And the lesson to take away from that is not that it's easier to do in Paris, but the importance of political leadership. The mayor of Paris is awesome. She's completely committed to this. She's devoted herself and I think she's been the mayor for 10 years now or even longer. And this is her thing. And she's just, busted people's knees to make this happen. And so that is what I would point to as the sort of archetype.
Okay. So blue sky, if we stopped right now, we would freeze this. No pun intended. We would halt things as they are today.
Yeah.
But there's some pretty radical solutions that are being bandied about and discussed in a serious way. Solar geoengineering is one. Can you talk a little bit about what those schemes are, and if you have what your thoughts are on those?
Yeah. So I'll be brief about this. I did. One of my previous books was called How to Cool the Planet, which was about these schemes of manipulating the Earth's climate and stuff to cool things off. If all of you bought a copy of the book, you would triple the total sales of that book. It was an idea that I was way ahead of, way too far ahead of. But the short version of it is there's all kinds of ideas about how to cool things down without actually cutting fossil fuel emissions, right? Or cutting, even if we did cut fossil fuel emissions, trying to still cool things down, because as I said, we've already built in all this warming. So there's crazy-ass things like towing glaciers down and putting tarps over glaciers to stop them from melting and all that. There's just nutty stuff. Dumping iron in the ocean to stimulate plankton blooms that'll absorb CO2 and then sink it down. I won't waste time with all that. The thing that's most important is this idea of spraying particles into the stratosphere. Essentially, we know that scientists know that when volcanoes erupt, they shoot particles into the stratosphere. Those tiny particles float around up there. They act as tiny little sunshades reflecting away sunlight. And all you have to do is reflect away 1 or 2% of the sunlight, and it can cool the temperatures on the planet by 1 or 2, 3, 4 degrees. And that has happened in previous volcanic eruptions. It's very straightforward. The problem is it rains out of the sky after a year or two, and so it ends. But the idea is to use high-altitude aircraft with plume sprayers to fly around and put little particles in the stratosphere and cool off the planet and lower the temperature. And it is as I talk about it in the book, a bad idea whose time has come. Because there is more and more gaining momentum for this as Americans and the world loves techno fixes, and this is a techno fix, right? We don't have to forget all this hassle of shutting down coal plants and driving EVs and all these other things. Why don't we just get a bunch of airplanes and spray particles in the stratosphere and we'll be fine? Well, it's not fine. There's lots of reasons why. Among them is it shifts monsoon patterns and it's like it's like a Frankenstein idea of like we're already fucking things up pretty well, and then to go to that scale of actually messing with the whole system, the climate system on that scale is a very scary notion, but it is gaining momentum, and it's gaining momentum because these impacts are getting so extreme, and people are more and more saying we need to do something, and so the idea, let's just spray some sulfur up in the stratosphere and be done with it, right?
I mean, it's also important to remember how Earth has been self-regulating for all time.
Right.
90% of the heat that humans have created has been absorbed by the ocean. Without that, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. The trees of the Amazon, the trees all around you right here, plant life. The reflection of glaciers and snowpack in the winter, that albedo is cooling the planet radically by reflecting solar radiation back into the sky. So the Earth is trying, and the Earth is just fine, by the way. It's us that are in trouble. The Earth has been trying, and there are some emerging geoengineering techniques that kind of nudge what the Earth is already doing. That may or may not work. It's hard to say. But with carbon, with cutting down, putting the greenhouse gases up there that we are already doing, if we can just try to reduce a little bit at a time, it is feasible at some point that Earth's natural systems will continue doing what they're doing. But it might be a multi-pronged attack to kind of tone this down.
So what we're up against, Louisiana just a week ago became the, I think, 10th or 11th state to pass legislation that classified natural gas as green energy. So every time industry uses, or when LNG is used, or liquid natural gas is used, it counts towards Louisiana's stated goals towards greenhouse emission reduction. It's just a...
I mean, Louisianans are going to pay that price, and they've already paid it several times over and over.
Everyone keeps paying the price, but there have been lawsuits that have been brought against industry now in multiple states, 40 I think lawsuits now against oil and gas, holding them accountable. And you equated it. We discussed this a little bit prior to tonight. Equating the industry to tobacco, saying they're lying to the public. And tell us about these lawsuits and whether or not they've been successful.
Well, this is a really important development, I think, in the climate conversation. And it's kind of homegrown here, too. The city and county of Boulder in 2018 filed a lawsuit against ExxonMobil. They were one of the pioneering lawsuits that basically, is arguing that the oil companies knew what the effects of burning fossil fuels would be. There's been a lot of reporting and research on this, I mean, back to the 50s and early 60s, there's lots of memos and studies and things that have come out that showing that these oil companies understood what the impacts of burning fossil fuels would be, and spent decades, funding science that was contrary to that, greenwashing, basically lying about this. And these lawsuits, the Boulder one being one of several of the most prominent, are saying, okay, this is. You lied, and you are committed the equivalent of sort of fraud, right? And now we need you to help us pay for the damages that climate change is causing. We talked about adaptation. Well, places like Colorado, Boulder in particular, is arguing that it's going to cost them hundreds of millions of dollars to adapt to climate change. In a lot of the ways that I mentioned before, water supply systems, sewage systems, all kinds of things, right? Given that we are now in a radically different climate, who is going to pay for all that? Are you going to pay for it? Are you happy to do that? Like to pay the hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's just in Boulder. When you think about this on a statewide scale, when you think about this on a national scale, when you think about this on an international scale, the numbers get huge. And so what the Boulder case is basically arguing is that these oil companies should help pay for some of the damages. They should contribute to this, that there should be some kind of fund that they pay into to help pay for this adaptation for the damages of these events that they knew they were contributing to. The Boulder case is particularly interesting because just in May, the Colorado Supreme Court, the oil and ExxonMobil has been trying to move it out of state court into a federal court, and the Colorado Supreme Court said no, it's staying in state court here. So now it's moving toward discovery. It'll have huge implications, these lawsuits, because it's sort of basically the thing that my kids knew when they were like 5, which is like, you broke it, you fix it, right? I mean, it's not that complicated. It, of course, is incredibly complicated in a legal sense, but in a moral sense, it's not that complicated.
I mean, they converted a supertanker in the 1970s to study the ocean. They created the first CO2 monitors in the ocean that are still being used today. They engineered that. And they tested to see how much CO2 was going into the ocean, how much CO2 was going out of power plants and whatnot, and did a massive oceanographic study and got the results and were told to bury them. And they didn't scuttle the ship, but put it back in service. And that was just discovered, 4 years ago?
Yeah.
A journalist kind of uncovered all of that investigation. When I was at NOAA looking at their CO2 monitors, they were describing to me how they just borrowed this from what Exxon had taught them 50 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I can just add one thing, which is I think that this conversation that we've been having about adaptation and about where we're going with climate change is really now rapidly coming down to money. I mean, it's really about, not just money, on the, like in Texas, where I live, it's the belly of the beast from climate impacts, but we also are the leaders in wind and solar. So there's tons of money being made by entrepreneurs who are building wind and solar plants and undercutting gas and coal plants, because renewables are cheaper now to do. So there's money to be made there. But the real question about money is in these adaptation costs. Who is going to pay for this? I mean, we see this on a micro scale just in the Texas floods. Like the Kerr County didn't want to pay for a warning system for the flooding. Neither did the state of Texas. So now we have 200 plus people dead. Who's going to pay for all this stuff? Who's going to pay for the warning system on every other river? Who's going to pay for the replumbing of South Florida? Who's going to pay for it in Boulder? That is going to be a huge question, and it's going to only accelerate in the coming years, because these impacts that we're seeing are going to become bigger, stronger, more profound, and more expensive.
And they're moving.
Right.
So those are places that saw historical flooding, historical hurricane activity,
right.
And now we've got Hurricane Helene bowling out of the Gulf right up to North Carolina hill country,
right.
Who had no defenses against that. Hurricanes hitting Oman, hurricanes hitting France and Portugal. They don't have dikes, they don't have levees, they don't have any warning systems for this. And that's what Dr. Murakami was saying to me that scares him the most is, these cyclones that were hitting the Middle East were hitting a nation that had absolutely no idea what was going on. Right. When you see it happening in a place that sadly it happens again and again, they slowly build up knowledge and some resistance and whatnot. But climate change is very active and is moving very quickly. And it is, once again, we can't move cities. Cities are just sitting there waiting for the next thing. And
right.
So are towns and a lot of infrastructure.
Porter, your wife is heroically staying at home with you have an 18-month-old.
Yes, she is. Yes, I do.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Where will that child's grandchildren ski?
Maybe.
How?
I hope so.
Under a bubble?
I sure hope so. But I do think that there's a lot of questions out there right now. We have this overturning current I was talking about that is slowing down, and in the northern hemisphere could actually create a pretty severe cold snap for some time while the rest of the planet is warming. Again, everything is in motion. Almost anything can happen. Like, we think we know the trajectory, and we keep getting surprised by a lot of things. So I do think there will be skiing for his children. I just think they're going to have to travel quite a ways to do it. Yeah.
Like to Antarctica.
All right, it's pretty grim, and I wanted to, before we turn it over to the audience, I'd like to ask about, in your travels or in your reporting, what's given you a sense of hope? Come on,
I gotta
dig
go.
deep.
No,
I got a date.
First of all, hope is a complicated thing, right? Is it like hope, like I get a bicycle for Christmas? Is that the kind of hope you're talking about? Or, what kind of hope are you really talking about? But I will say that, I've been writing about this for 25 years, and people always ask me, like, why are you not drinking bourbon in your basement, scrawling on the walls with crayons,
Wait, you're not doing that? That's
Only
what I
on
do.
Wednesdays. But, I one of the great things about it is, about thinking about this, is that you meet a lot of incredibly inspiring people. I mean, I meet unbelievably inspiring people all the time who are entrepreneurs or inspiring urban planners, hard to imagine, but they're out there, right? There are activists, young kids. Think about this. There's a case that will be, we should hear a judgment on in a couple of weeks at the International Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the world, in the UN. And it's about this question of responsibility for climate change. And I know that it sounds far away and distant, but it's an incredibly inspiring story. It started with a professor 10 years ago in a law school in Vanuatu, of all places, way out in the Pacific, who made a joke in class because one of the kids was from the Solomon Islands in the class, and she was concerned about her village and about what's going to happen to her village as the seas rise. They're already seeing damages. And he joked to her and said, well, why don't you take this to the International Court of Justice and see what they can do about it? And she said, oh, that's a good idea. And her professor was like, well, yeah, but that's there and you're here, and you're just a law student, you have no, and she said, no, I think we can do this. And she started talking to the other students, and they said, yeah, we can do this. And they had no money. They made banners that they put out in the plaza, and they sold little tags to make enough money to buy a website and to build a website, and they just started doing it. And they made it to the International Court of Justice. It was heard in January. 120 nations or something came and gave testimony. There's going to be a verdict in 3 weeks, and it's going to have a big impact on how everybody thinks about climate change. And, people like that student are amazing, incredible, right? And so in my travels, that's the kind of thing that I encounter that gives me hope.
Yeah, and the scientists.
Right.
Who are so brilliant. And do you have the same scenario where you do an hour-and-a-half interview and you walk out of there and not one thing made sense? Because it's so deep in the science, but then we spend weeks afterwards transcribing and learning and figuring out what they said. But what they're learning about, it's not just about climate change, what they're learning about our planet is absolutely incredible, and it is so inspiring. When I went to speak with Dr. Murakami, and he told me that his wife had just discovered that in the typhoon generation zone in the northwestern Pacific, whenever that got really rowdy and was spinning off big storms, you would see a total lack of snowfall in Antarctica every single time. This correlation. It was so incredible. And then he tells me this. note that he came up with his senior boss, who got the Nobel Prize 2 years ago, that the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere directly correlate to the severity of these storms that I've been writing about. As it goes up, the severity goes up. You're looking at, by the end of the century, 190 mile per hour winds. As it goes down, the wind speed drops. And it is not this terrible kind of momentum that I'd always learned about climate change, that it'll take centuries for us to unwind what we've done. It was within a year, possibly two. It was a direct one-to-one correlation, which I thought was deeply inspiring for us to someday flatline, possibly even start to draw down. And you will see that in storm activity, tornadoes, hurricanes, atmospheric rivers, flooding, almost immediately. That was really inspiring to me.
Hopeful.
Yeah.
All right, it's your turn. Right behind my daughter, Emma. Poke her.
Hi, thank you. And would you agree that one thing we could all do as individuals, either beginning with this evening's meal or tomorrow morning's meal, is consume less meat, dairy, and eggs? Because 99% of the meat, dairy, and eggs we consume comes from factory farms. And we know, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Department and others, that raising animals to be eaten as food generates more climate pollution than the entire worldwide transportation sector?
It's true, but again, this is getting into personal choices of people, which we need to talk to the community at large about this. But it's like moving your house. It's like moving your family. There are so many decisions that come into that. And I don't really know the way to push that wedge in. Like, I don't really know how to explain that to folks in Texas and, Alabama or Maine, where I grew up. I mean, I would get a real mouthful if I said that to some of the old timers in my town. But there has to be an educational way to do that, because you're spot on about that. The same with commuter traffic, the same with all of the big emitters. If we can take some of those big pieces out, we'll be well on our way.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, beef is the worst, right? I mean, there's 10 times worse than pork and chicken, and when you look at it from a greenhouse gas point of view. So, not eating beef is one of the most powerful personal choices that you can make for greenhouse gas, impacts. But as Porter said, walking into a barbecue joint in Texas and bringing this up is that's why everybody has the right to carry in Texas.
There's a gentleman on the end in the back. Hold on one second.
I feel like you're just touching on what I think is the real problem, which is the country has to be educated. And there has to be a really large PR program that addresses this in so many ways, throughout the year. Because without that education, the country will never support, whether it's not eating beef or whatever the other solutions might be, or the candidates who support these things. They will not support it. And they'll listen to, I think Marjorie Taylor Greene introduced something in Congress today that would shoot down the idea of putting pellets in the sky, things like that. So I feel that's the best way to address this problem, is to mount a very large PR program that goes on for probably a few years.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, Jeff, that I see that as a possibility. It kind of reminds me of the big recycling push that happened in the 80s that we now know was done by the oil industry, because they wanted to make it seem like plastic was recyclable in an easy way. But what I was going to say is, what I think is even more inspiring is, not to butter you all up, but small communities like this that are showing how it's done. And that makes national headlines. And to be perfectly honest, Americans are competitive. And they're very rebellious at heart. I had a hurricane forecaster tell me, in parts of Asia and Europe and whatnot, when the alarm goes off and you hear 3 blasts, that means go home and everyone goes home. He was like, you try that in the United States and people just stay outside to just go against what you're supposed to do. It's kind of in our DNA in some weird way. But also in our DNA is to see a place like Aspen, a place like Bethel, Maine, a place, there are many examples, San Francisco, that are really doing incredible things for mitigating climate change and adapting. And other communities catch on and are like, well, not only do we want to do that, but that's saving them a ton of money. It's a cleaner, safer place to live. There are so many upsides to that. So maybe a mix of the two, but leading by example in small communities like this is incredibly powerful, I think.
There's a couple over here. Maybe, yeah.
Hello. So you guys were talking about how adaptation for a long time was kind of taboo to talk about, and there was more focus on mitigation. And now we're coming into more talk about adaptation, but it's definitely less. I'm seeing that as someone who's a year away from graduating and looking for a career in the climate crisis, and all of the job opportunities that I see are focused on mitigation. I was wondering if you have any advice for someone who's looking for a career in climate adaptation, or just other thoughts on like why do you think that is, and how do you think we get adaptation more into the forefront of people's minds?
First of all, congratulations on choosing a booming industry to. There's no question that there's going to be lots, more of this. Whether it's called climate adaptation or not is, a different issue. But it's the sort of adapt or die thing, right? It's not a question of like, do we want to, or it's a question of will we, and who and where, right? And so for jobs, I think, first of all, again, congratulations on I think this is a really, really important field, and I think there's tons of opportunities. And I think as a young person looking for a job, look for people who are doing, people who are doing the kind of work on the kinds of projects that you're interested in, right? There's like urban planning, and there's all kinds of levels of this, right? So I don't know what your particular field is, but I can tell you from someone who writes about this and talks to these people all the time that when I first started writing about climate change, it was like people would look at me like I was writing about the sex life of porcupines. It was like, oh, that's cute, Jeff. That's fun. I'm glad you're amused by that. Nobody cared. Now everybody cares, even if they care in a MAGA kind of way or not, but everybody cares. And so whether you're in finance, urban planning, agriculture, everybody is thinking about, oh my God, what do we do? How do we think about this differently? And how do we win? Because one of the things that's going to happen is there's going to be sort of winners and losers in this. People are going to make money and do better because they realize, oh, this is happening, and so how can I take advantage of this? And I think that the scale of the opportunity for people who are smart and also get that is enormous.
I just want to say also congratulations, and to all the parents out here. In a way, after reporting on this for a very long time, become slightly disenchanted with my generation. And I do feel like folks like this young lady and even younger, even my 18-month-old son, I want them to work in that industry. Like I think it'll be good for their career, but I also think that those kids know more about climate change than we ever knew until we were in middle age. They're growing up with it. It's not this ghost in the closet like it is for us, like, whoa, where'd that come from and why is this happening? Like, it's just part of life for them. It's not as scary. And the more you can do in your local schools with your kids, with these younger generations, they're the ones They're the ones that are going to save us. Those kids in high school, they're going to be in political office in 10 years, okay? And in 10 years, a lot of people who are in political office right now that are kind of screwing things up are going to be gone. So we need those kids. It might be our last hope.
The woman standing in the aisle, I'm sorry, I'm making you run.
What 5 states do you think are the safest in this country? And what, you mentioned Scandinavia, but they're surrounded by water. What 5 countries do you think are also the safest?
Jeff?
Well, okay, so, I mean, that's a good question and an understandable question, but I also think that it is a problematic question, because I think the idea of safety in this is that there's a place you can go that is going to be a refuge is contrary to what we know about the way climate change is unfolding, right? So one of the things that's happening is climate is moving in directions and in places that we didn't understand before, and there's all these cascading consequences. One simple example is the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest in 2021, Portland, Oregon, Washington, 115, 116, 117 degrees. Towns in British Columbia essentially spontaneously combusting. It was so hot. Nobody predicted that, right? That was, if you would have asked me like 5 years ago, where are the safe places in America, the safest places, I would have said Portland, Oregon, Asheville, North Carolina, which just got devastated by Hurricane Helene. I mean,
British Columbia.
So I think the safest places are not geographic, they're kind of in your head. They're in how you think about where you live and how you prepare for things where you are. And I think that the notion that we can point to a spot on the map that where everything will be okay is not the way it works. And, I say this again as somebody who lives in the belly of the beast,
It's just changing also. It's all changing.
Yeah.
When Caesar rode into the Sahara, it was a savanna with giant trees they had to chop down to make their way through. Like, it's just all changing very, very quickly. So we sort of need to address the big picture top down, make it safe for all of us.
We have time for one more. I can't tell if is it Mitzi back there? No. You with the silver hair and waving to me. Yeah, sorry. This is the only way I can see. You guys have to.
What do you say to people that don't believe in climate change?
Jeff? It's a tough
come
one.
to Texas. You'll be welcome. I mean, you'll be among others like-minded. I think that this is, we haven't really talked about this yet tonight, but, let's be blunt. We're living with an administration with a president who's doing everything he can, and an administration is doing everything they can to destroy any kind of understanding of climate change. They're dismantling scientific databases. They're taking down NOAA's websites. They're defunding National Science Foundation. This is a very dark and kind of dangerous time where this idea that climate change is some kind of conspiracy of, crazy, tree hugger. It's some kind of woke thing, right? It's like some woke idea is very prevalent right now, and it's a very different political dynamic than it was, the entire rest of my career, the last 20 years writing about this. It was not like this under the Bush administration, right? There was problems with like too many coal plants, things like that. But when it comes to actually, accelerating denial and darkness about this is an unprecedented moment. So, when I try to, the problem with trying to kind of talk to people who don't believe in climate change or whatever, is that there's nothing that I'm going to say in 5 minutes that's going to change their mind, because it's connected with a whole range of other political, social, cultural things, right? And so it's not like I'm going to say, oh, look at this graph from Jim Hansen, right? Look at this picture of the Arctic in 1920 and look at it now, or look at this glacier, or, whatever. There's nothing that I am going to say that is going to convince anyone. So I've given up on that part of it, frankly. I want to talk to people like you, and frankly like me, who walked out into a heat wave in Phoenix and decided to run 10 blocks and almost died. I was stupid. I didn't even understand how dangerous heat was. And to me, my goal is to try to communicate with people who understand climate change, but don't really understand the full consequences of it, don't understand the cascading impacts, both sort of tragic and good, in the sense of we were talking about before, about opportunities, thinking differently about building a better world. So that's my long answer to that very appropriate and
don't
question.
forget that 61% of Americans don't just believe in climate change, are actively worried about it regularly. And just like Jeff said, you actually don't have to say anything. Lead by example. Find the biggest lever that you have in your community that can push for climate change policy. Vote. Try to get more people to vote. And hopefully that number will rise and rise and rise. It is the majority right now. It's 2/3 of America, thankfully.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. That was a great way to end.
Thank you.
That was good.